Paul's theology of law and gospel, which is often picked up more by Lutherans and Calvinists than by Catholics, has a truth, but you don't want to overstate it. And the way I'd phrase it is this way: law is not a bad thing, but legalism is. Having norms, having guidelines, having road signs is helpful. If I close my mind and just follow those, I'm a robot. Life is not just about following the rule book. Now that doesn't mean those are bad rules. That's just saying, boy, without God's grace, without a little flexibility, without some heart and compassion, without struggling with some of the exceptions to the rule book, I'm not truly human, I'm not truly Christian.
I think that when we talk about sin, most people confuse sin with where they're disordered. And as a matter of fact, that's where people are doing a lot of work, where they're disordered. It might seem strange, but they're actually doing a lot of moral work. Often enough, you know, you'll listen to a person say, you know, for 40 years I've been struggling with my anger. Well, you know, I think that that's really terrific. I'll say that that's wrong, you know, that's disorder that's going on. But the moral integrity of examining, really working on this, I'm not too sure that I see a lot of sin there. I always think that we sin in our strength, not in our weakness. When I read the gospel, that's what I hear Jesus talking about. Jesus is always talking about sin in people being sanctimonious, being secure, not needing the doctor. You know, that sin is really a resistance. I teach my students, sin is the failure to bother to love. Sin is the failure to bother to love. Sin is not doing something wrong. Maybe if you do something wrong, it is a sin. But the real sin is the failure to bother to love. I use the story of the Good Samaritan. You know, the interesting point of the Good Samaritan parable is there is that man laying in the road. Right? How did he get there? I mean, the muggers are not highlighted. That, you know, the man is there. Jesus is not saying, and the sinner in this story are those two people who, or 3 people, or the 16 people who beat up the poor man who's laying in the road. The sin seems to be in the priest and the Levite who pass by the man, who fail to bother to love. Now let's imagine that the Good Samaritan, the third person, comes along, and he grabs, you know, the poor man who's laying in the road, and he puts him on his mule. And he's going to take him to the inn where he's going to be taken care of. But he drops him, and the poor man falls and, you know, it hits his skull. Now he's bleeding. Then he keeps walking, and he gets lost. They get caught in a storm. The poor man who's been laying in the road now has a fractured skull. Now he's, you know, got pneumonia, and he's nowhere near any inn. Is the Good Samaritan any less good? I don't think so. I mean, the story certainly has the Good Samaritan bringing him to the inn, doing everything right. But the real issue is, did the person bother to love? Now, that doesn't mean that every person just says, I love in any way. No, I think a person who really loves tries to find the right. Tries to find the right. So sin is really the failure to bother to find the right. It doesn't mean that you have to find the right. You have to be looking for it. And I think that where we're weak is where we're always trying to find the right. And where we're strong, we just sit back, you know, kick off our shoes, and we say, well, I'm almost there. And that way that we're so at ease with ourselves and let ourselves scot-free, I think that's where we should be looking for sin. Sin is where we're strong.
If there's one line that, one soundbite that sums up Christian ethics, it comes at the end of the parable of the Good Samaritan. Jesus has told the story, very familiar, about the guy who finds a man in the ditch, and the priest comes by, the Levite comes by, and they ignore him, and the Samaritan comes by, and he does all these wonderful things, helps the guy out. End of the story, Jesus turns to the lawyer who asked the question originally, who's my neighbor, and says, which one of them was neighbor to the man in the ditch? And the man said, well, the one who showed compassion. He didn't say the Samaritan, because it probably would stick in his craw, because the Samaritans are national enemies. But he says, the one who showed compassion. And Jesus said, go and do likewise. And I think that those 4 words sum it up. Jesus doesn't say, go and do the same thing exactly that this Samaritan did, nor does he say, go and do whatever you want. He says, go and do likewise. And I think that the whole business of ethics hangs in that word likewise. We are called not to be clones of Christ or clones of the first disciples, but to think what it would be like to act in a similar way in our situation. So that likewise makes for a lot of creativity. It doesn't mean you do exactly what this guy did, but it also means that there's ways in which a parable like the Good Samaritan becomes a point of reference for us that you just can't dodge. You know, there is. I mean, every time we see a homeless person, every time we read about what's going on in Angola or Rwanda, I mean, we ought to feel the rub, because there's a likewise that we ought to be doing. We've got to figure out what that is. That's where a lot of the creative stuff comes. But the faithful side of it is, we're faithful to that message about compassion and about helping these people in the ditch. The biblical foundations are about the relationship to Christ and learning his story well enough that we can creatively and faithfully live it in our time and in our situation.